some of you are probably really familiar with good old Jacob, Laban, Rachel, and Leah, right? Bad boys, the Bible comes back one more time. But I'm going to tell those of you who didn't show up for Bible study a few months ago, the part of the story, more of the story, that what you remember what you heard last week about the scoundrel Jacob tricking his blind as a bat dad, Isaac, into giving Jacob his inheritance and blessing, that inheritance and blessing that should have gone to the older twin Esau, and how Jacob had to hightail it out of town. Remember that last week? You probably also remember that God came to Jacob in a dream and promised that Jacob would be safe and sound. And as you might also remember, and this is the part that you need to remember, Jacob, instead of being grateful, bargained with God. Jacob told God that he would accept God if God did truly keep the promise that Jacob would always have plenty to eat, clothes, shelter, and end up being well off. And last week, we also found out that God doesn't necessarily do things our way. Sometimes we can't figure out what God is doing. God accepts that scoundrel Jacob and promises to take care of him and all people. What does that tell us about God? Does God really see us differently than we see ourselves? Does God actually love everybody, even people we hate? Anyway, our Jacob saga isn't over yet. It goes on, as a matter of fact. And what Kathy read this morning is the next part of the story. You see, Jacob is still out there in the desert, munching on whatever is left of the sandwiches Mama Rebecca packed, as he tries to find his way to Uncle Laban's place. Eventually, our pal Jacob ends up at a well that's covered with a huge stone. Now, some other folks are at the well, along with their flocks, and Jacob, whose parched throat reminds him of his thirst, wants some water. Unfortunately, no one seems to be willing to move this stone that's covering the well, and he can't understand what the problem is. By now, we should know a little thing or two about wells during these days. And you may have heard that sometimes they have served as single bars of the dead. Just remember that. Often they were considered community property, and no one was supposed to take any water until the flocks and their keepers showed up at the end of the day. When Jacob arrived at this well, not everyone was back from the pastures yet. So folks just sort of passed the time chit-chatting while they waited. Now evidently the heat was getting to Jacob, and that made him a little bit disoriented. So when he asked, just where in the world am I? And by golly, he found out that he was in Haran. And yes, indeed, they all knew Jacob's uncle Laban. As a matter of fact, someone said, here comes one of Laban's daughters now. Her name is Rachel. Now then, Rachel was leading some livestock to the well, and suddenly, in an instant, Iron Man Jacob removes the heavy stone from the well all by himself. It was truly an Iron Man move, but Jacob had to impress Rachel somehow. You see, it was love at first sight as far as Jacob was concerned. You need to remember that part. Anyway, Jacob told Rachel that he was Rebekah's son, and that news overjoyed things were going great for Jacob. So Jacob, in a bold and uncharacteristic move, offered to work for Laban. Now, by now, we should know that with Jacob, there had to be an ulterior motive. Sure enough, Jacob was willing to work so long as he could have Rachel for a bride. So for 7 years, Jacob worked for Laban. All that time, Laban was happy because his flocks and herds prospered under Jacob's care. Thanks to Jacob's golden touch, Laban was becoming a wealthy man. 7 years come and go. It's time for a wedding. Jacob was thrilled. He could hardly wait for his wedding night in the tent. What a time that would be. But sometimes it's smart to remember that what goes around comes around. Good old unsuspecting Jacob had met his match. In the morning, he woke up and discovered that he hadn't married Rachel after all. His wife was Laban's older daughter, Leah. Not good news for Jacob. Jacob, the trickster, had been tricked himself. Good old Uncle Laban explained that in their part of the world, the younger daughter couldn't be married until after the older daughter. So after some good old-fashioned haggling and arguing, another bargain was made between Laban and Jacob. Jacob ended up working for 7 more years before he could marry Rachel. Maybe Jacob is finally getting what he deserves. Now, from what we know about Jacob so far, this story seems uncharacteristic for Jacob. We might have thought that he would have schemed and connived his way out of the marriage to Leah and just run off with Rachel. For some reason, Jacob stuck around and waited for Rachel. Maybe this trusting God business was beginning to take hold as far as Jacob was concerned. Whatever. Jacob trusted that Laban would keep his promise eventually, and he would be able to marry Rachel, and that's just what happened. Promises, promises. Maybe they do mean something in God's world after all. So now you've come. So now, that's the first part of this morning's message. Now we have come to the second part. This is Promises, Promises, Part 2. Are you ready? Okay. Once upon a time, there was a man named Thomas Wheeler, who was the CEO of a large life insurance company. One day, he and his wife were driving along the freeway when he noticed the car was running low on gas. Wheeler got off the highway and at the next exit had found a rundown gas station with just one gas pump. He asked the loan attendant to fill the tank and check the oil. Obviously, this is an old story, right? Remember that. Anyway, while the attendant went to work, Wheeler decided to take a little walk around the gas station to stretch his legs. As he was returning to the car, he noticed that the attendant and his wife were engaged in an animated conversation. Their conversation stopped as he paid the attendant. But as Wheeler was getting back to the car, he saw the attendant wave and say, "It was good talking to you," to his wife. As they drove out of the station, Wheeler asked his wife if she knew the man. She readily admitted that she did. They'd gone to high school together and had dated steadily for about a year. "Boy, were you lucky that I came along," bragged Wheeler. "If you had married him, you'd be the wife of a gas station attendant instead of the wife of a chief executive officer." "My dear," replied the wife, "if I had married him, he would be the chief executive officer and you would be the gas station attendant. just simple stories that are meant to change perspectives. These are stories of faith about ordinary people living ordinary lives in ordinary places. Today we heard 5 stories that Jesus told, one right after the other. We don't even have time to settle down and catch our breath. The stories just keep coming and coming and coming. Nevertheless, Jesus' audience that day seemed to understand what he was saying. They got the message. Without any fanfare or elaborate settings, there he was, out in the open, simply talking to anyone who was willing to listen. Jesus told his audience about a tiny, simple mustard seed that was planted along with the good seeds the farmer was scattering in his field. Now the mustard seed, bush, or tree was really a weed, something farmers didn't want to have growing among their wheat crop. But there it was, planted next to the good seed, and that little mustard seed grew and grew and grew. It grew so well that it became a tree that offered homes to birds. Before anyone could count to 10, Jesus told another story this time, a story about a woman who used yeast or leaven to make bread. Now, to the audience that day, this story must have invoked gasps of disbelief. You see, leaven or yeast was considered unclean among the faithful of the day. Yeast was never used in bread or any sort of baking. Yeast was swept out of homes before Passover celebrations. Yet here was a woman who used yeast one day, and miracle of miracles, she had enough bread to feed everyone in town and beyond. Now, just as people were beginning to recover from the incredible yeast story, Jesus zings us with a story about someone who finds valuable treasure hidden in a field. Now, that may seem a bit absurd to our ears. In those days, people didn't have safe deposit boxes or banks or safes in their homes. So it was quite natural for people who had something valuable to bury it, with the intention of returning to dig up the treasure when it was needed. All too often, the treasure was lost or forgotten. People died, and surviving family members may not have known about the valuable treasure buried in the dirt. People hearing Jesus tell this story about buried treasure was just an ordinary story. But the extraordinary part was the notion that this treasure was so valuable that the person was willing to give up everything else he had in his life so he could own this treasure trove. Just as everyone around Jesus was taking it all in, he told another story about a merchant who was looking for pearls to sell for a profit. No need to explain a whole lot here. I think we understand what the pearl dealer was up to. The amazing part of the story was the man's discovery of the most incredible pearl hidden among the smaller and somewhat flawed pearls. So the merchant sold everything in order to own that one perfect pearl in the gem, in the bunch. There's one more story to go, and it's all about fish. When the fishers threw their nets into the sea, they managed to pull in quite a catch. But some of the fish weren't worth keeping. Yet the fish they kept filled basket after basket, so the fishers could have enough to sell and still feed themselves and their families at the end of the day. 5 stories, and Jesus asks those gathered around him, "Do you understand? Do you get the point?" he asks. And it seems without any hesitation, the crowd answers, "Yeah, we got it." But just what is it they got? These aren't stories that capture our imagination. They aren't stories that instill great feelings or emotions in us. These are just simple, So just what is it we're supposed to get? Well, you see, hidden in each one of these simple stories is a spectacular gift. These are stories about extraordinary outcomes with ordinary beginnings. My husband had a grandfather named Steve. Grandpa Steve came from Hungary. He fled Hungary in the early part of the 20th century, really early part. He didn't want to be taken into the emperor's army and forced to kill members of his family, which was happening in those days. So he arrived in New York without any papers or identification or credentials. Eventually, he made his way to Cleveland, and that's where he settled. Now, Grandpa Steve was short and slender. He chain-smoked Lucky Strike cigarettes. Steve was suspicious of anyone who wasn't Hungarian. That included me. And he hated entire groups of people just because they were alive. Steve shouted out his hatred to anyone who would listen. Family dinners often ended up with Grandpa Steve pounding the table, yelling at the top of his lungs, while cigarette ashes landed on his dinner plate. One day, my husband took me to visit Grandpa Steve. Grandpa Steve lived in a small house located in a blue-collar neighborhood in Cleveland. And most of his neighbors were immigrants as well. There was nothing remarkable or special about Steve's surroundings. But when I entered the house, I became breathless. The sight in front of me was astonishing. There, in every room of that small house, was the most magnificent furniture I have ever seen. The dining room was filled with an octagonal table, and the center of the table was inlaid with a beautiful sunburst. The edges of the table were inlaid with intricate flowers. The sideboard, or credenza as we called it, was gorgeous. It was made from mahogany with inlaid geometric patterns that matched the table. The small bedrooms contained the same sort of furniture. Bed frames that were inlaid with beautiful floral patterns, dresses that were much too large for the small space, wardrobes of mahogany, inlaid pieces of cherry, walnut, and maple lined the walls. Each piece of furniture had been handmade by Grandpa Steve. See, before he left Hungary, he had been taught how to create works of art that were tables, dressers, and bed frames. Each piece was skillfully and artfully created with Grandpa's hand tools and his imagination. Today, Grandpa's furniture is gracing my son's homes. Each piece is unique and deeply cherished by our family. Do you understand? Are you getting it? Jesus tells us that spectacular surprises are hidden in us ordinary folks. Grandpa Steve was unpleasant. He wasn't perfect. He was a bigot.